Imagine waking up in the dark of a Tudor morning, not to the sound of birdsong, nor to the warmth of a fire crackling in your hearth, but to the heavy, unmistakable stench of human waste. The Tudor world was not a clean one. Cities bustled with life, but they also festered with filth. Rubbish piled up in alleys, chamber pots were emptied into the street, and open sewers trickled through crowded neighborhoods. People wore strong perfumes not only as a mark of wealth, but also as a shield, a defense against the overwhelming odors that hung in the air like a permanent fog. And at the very heart of this landscape, hidden in the shadows but essential to the survival of the town, was one of the most reviled and yet vital jobs in history: the Gong Farmer. The name itself might sound strange. Gong did not mean a bell or a chime in this world. It meant something far earthier. In Tudor English, gong was another word for human excrement. And so, a Gong Farmer was a man whose sole duty was to climb down into the cesspits of towns and cities and remove what had accumulated there. He was not tending fields, though the title made it sound so. He was farming human waste, hauling away the stinking remnants of entire households, inns, and taverns. Without him, Tudor life would have drowned in its own refuse. With him, life could go on, though few would ever thank him for it. To understand just how disgusting, yet vital, this job was, you must first imagine the world of Tudor sanitation. In wealthy homes, you might find a garderobe, a small wooden cubicle built over a shaft, where waste would fall into a cesspit below. In poorer households, chamber pots were the norm, emptied into ditches or pits. Public latrines existed in cities, built over great vaults that filled day by day with human waste. And when those pits and vaults became too full, someone had to climb in and dig it all out by hand. That someone was the Gong Farmer. He worked at night. The law forbade them from doing their work in daylight hours, for the sight, and more importantly, the smell, was too offensive for polite society. So, as the sun set, when shutters were drawn and households quieted, the Gong Farmer and his men began their descent. With lanterns, shovels, and great leather buckets they would climb, down into the darkness of cesspits where the air was thick with ammonia, and methane where the stench clung to the skin and clothes with a force soap could never quite erase. It was suffocating, sometimes even deadly. A careless breath could overwhelm a man, knock him unconscious, and leave him to drown in the very muck he was meant to collect. But the Gong Farmer did not have the luxury of refusal. This was his trade, often inherited or taken on by those who could not find work elsewhere. The law even regulated it. Only licensed Gong Farmers could take on the work, and they were required to haul the waste away to designated dumping grounds outside the city walls. There, the refuse would be piled high, left to rot, or sometimes sold on as fertilizer for fields, for even filth in time could serve a purpose. And yet, despite its necessity, the job was cursed with shame. A Gong Farmer was a man to be avoided. People crossed the street rather than pass him. His clothing, no matter how often washed, carried the smell. His hands bore the stains of his trade. Even his family suffered, for neighbors knew the stench followed them home. In society's eyes, he was polluted, tainted by his contact with waste. Some compared him to an executioner, necessary but shunned. Yet the irony was that Gong Farmers were often better paid than many other laborers. In the Tudor economy, filth had a price. Clearing a cesspit was dangerous and foul beyond imagining, and so it commanded a fee. Some Gong Farmers earned more in a single night than a skilled craftsman might make in a week. But wealth did not bring respect. You could line your purse with silver, but you could not wash away the stigma of being a man who climbed into cesspits. Imagine the silence of a Tudor street at midnight, broken only by the creak of wooden wheels and the clatter of iron-rimmed cartwheels on cobblestones. The Gong Farmers moved quietly, their lanterns casting pale circles on the walls, their carts loaded with buckets heavy enough to crack the spine. The smell preceded them, a foul wind announcing their approach. And though the town slept, some would stir, wrinkle their noses, and mutter a prayer of thanks that someone else had taken on such a job. And so, the Gong Farmer became a paradox of his age. He was despised yet needed, avoided yet relied upon. He was part of the machinery of Tudor life, hidden beneath its gilded surface of courtly banquets and royal decrees. For while courtiers in velvet robes danced in candle-lit halls, While merchants counted their coins and poets penned their sonnets, men in rags were knee-deep in human filth, ensuring the streets did not collapse into chaos. Without them, the city could not breathe. Without them, disease would have spread even faster than it did in those already pestilential times. But what was it like, truly, to live as one of these men? To wake each evening knowing that your night would be spent among the foulest smells and sights imaginable? To climb down into a pit that might be deeper than a man was tall, the walls slick, the ground uncertain, the air so noxious it burned the lungs? And to return home, weary, with coins in your hand but no welcome in your neighbor's eyes? This was the life of the Tudor Gong Farmer, the disgusting, dangerous, and strangely essential job that history has tried to forget, even as it depended upon it. And in this story, as we descend deeper into the world of the Gong Farmer, we will uncover not only the filth and stench of Tudor sanitation, but also the hidden truths of a society that balanced wealth and squalor, grandeur and grime, dignity and disgrace. For to understand the Tudors fully, one must not only look to their kings and queens, but also to the men who carried away their waste. As the rest of Tudor England lay tucked in bed, lulled into uneasy sleep by the sounds of dogs barking or church bells tolling the hour, the Gong Farmer began his shift. There was nothing glamorous about this life. He was not an artisan creating fine goods, not a sailor chasing fortune across the seas, not even a laborer tilling the soil by daylight. No, his craft began when others ended theirs. His tools were buckets, ropes, shovels, and lanterns. His workshop was a cesspit, a yawning hole beneath houses, taverns, and public latrines, filled with the accumulated waste of dozens, sometimes hundreds of people. The Gong Farmer's first step was to prepare. He wrapped cloths around his nose and mouth, not that it helped much, but it dulled the worst of the stench. Some claimed they chewed herbs like mint or rosemary, hoping to trick their senses into thinking the air was less foul. Others rubbed vinegar on their skin, believing it formed a barrier against the clinging stench. But nothing, truly nothing, could stop the smell from seeping into every pore, every thread, every breath. Then came the descent. With a rope tied around his waist, he lowered himself down into the cesspit. Sometimes the pit was shallow, no more than a few feet deep, half filled with slop. Other times it was as deep as 12 or 15 feet, a cavern of foulness beneath the earth. The walls dripped, slick with moisture and filth. The ground underfoot shifted unpleasantly, sucking at his boots. The air was heavy, thick with noxious gases. Some pits gave off a visible haze, shimmering in the light of his lantern. It was here that the true danger lay. The Tudor world did not know the science of methane or ammonia, but they knew, from bitter experience, that cesspits could kill. One careless breath, one misstep, and a Gong Farmer could collapse, overcome by fumes. More than one man drowned in the very muck he was hired to remove, his body later dragged up with solemn silence. It was a hazard of the trade, accepted grimly, as inevitable as blisters or broken bones in other professions. The work itself was brutal. With a wooden shovel, the Gong Farmer scooped the thick matter into buckets. The buckets were hauled up by ropes, lifted by assistants waiting above. Each one was heavy, sloshing, threatening to spill as it swung upward. From the pit, the farmer shouted hoarse instructions, his voice echoing in the hollow chamber. Up above, his men staggered under the weight, tipping the buckets into carts lined with planks or barrels. And then down again went the bucket, empty and waiting to be filled once more. This cycle repeated endlessly through the night: scoop, lift, tip. Scoop, lift, tip. The Gong Farmer's muscles ached, his eyes watered, his lungs burned. Sweat ran down his back, mingling with the grime. He lost all sense of time in the pit. The hours blurred into one long, reeking eternity, and yet there was method in the misery. Gong Farmers developed tricks to make their work bearable. They worked in teams, rotating tasks to stave off exhaustion. They chose their pits carefully, leaving the most dangerous ones until last. They kept an eye on one another, ready to haul a man out if he faltered. In a world without safety regulations, they made their own, born of bitter necessity. By dawn, their carts were loaded high with waste. The law required them to haul it beyond the city walls, to designated dumping grounds where no respectable citizen need witness the spectacle. These were known as lastels, vast mounds of refuse that steamed and stank in the morning air. Sometimes the waste was left to rot. Sometimes it was sold to farmers who spread it over their fields as fertilizer. For though the thought was revolting, human waste was rich in nutrients, and Tudor agriculture had no qualms about putting it to use. But before the waste could be hauled away, there was the journey. Imagine those carts trundling through the streets at night, their wheels rattling on cobblestones, their contents slopping with each bump. Imagine the smell, trailing behind them like a ghost that no prayer could banish. Doors were kept firmly shut as they passed. No one wanted to see them. No one wanted to admit how much they depended on them. When the work was done, the Gong Farmer returned home, weary, sore, and reeking. His clothes clung with stains. His hair and beard carried the odor. His skin burned from contact with the filth. Soap and water could not erase it. Neighbors knew when he returned, for the smell drifted into the street, carried on the morning air. Children pointed, women whispered, men avoided eye contact. And yet, in his pouch, the Gong Farmer carried coins. Silver, perhaps, if the job had been large enough. More than a carpenter or a blacksmith might earn for the same night's labor. It was dangerous, it was degrading, but it was profitable. For every full cesspit in the city meant work for him, and the cesspits never ceased to fill. This was the paradox of his life. He was despised, yet envied, scorned, yet needed, mocked, yet wealthier than some who mocked him, and so he endured. Night after night, pit after pit, bucket after bucket. For as long as Tudor England needed him, the Gong Farmer would descend into the darkness, shovel in hand, and emerge, unthanked, with the filth of a nation at his back. But what became of the waste once it left the city? And how did the presence of Gong Farmers shape Tudor society's relationship with cleanliness, disease, and morality? To answer that, we must look beyond the cesspits and follow the cart, rattling through the night to the Laistol, the dumping grounds of Tudor England, where filth itself became a commodity. The Gong Farmer's work did not end when the cesspit was emptied and the carts loaded. That was only the beginning of the journey. The waste itself, foul, unmentionable, rejected by all, still had a destination, and in Tudor England that destination was not always destruction. In a world where every resource was wrung dry, even excrement had a purpose, even filth had value. The carts rattled out of town, their wheels jolting over uneven stones, the lantern light swaying with each bump. The air was cool, but the smell clung thick and warm, trailing behind the farmers like a curse. No one came out to greet them. No one wished them Godspeed. The streets, usually alive with tradesmen shouting and merchants haggling, were deserted in those small hours of the night. Only the Gong Farmers moved, ghosts with carts of filth, creeping toward the edge of the city. Beyond the walls lay the Laistels, vast heaps of human and animal waste, rubbish, and refuse. These were dumping grounds, sanctioned by law, where filth could be piled out of sight and, ideally, out of mind. But the Laistels were not simply forgotten wastelands. They were markets in their own right, grim as they were. Farmers came to bargain for loads of night soil, for though the thought might curdle the stomach, the truth was undeniable. Dung made fields fertile. Crops fed on nutrients, and waste provided them in abundance. And so, what was a curse in the city became a blessing in the countryside. Buckets of stinking muck became manure for wheat fields and barley fields. The very excrement of Londoners might end up nourishing the bread on their own tables, though few would ever care to imagine the cycle in such detail. The Gong Farmer stood at the center of this economy of filth. He was not only a remover of waste, but also, in a strange way, a supplier of fertilizer. His labor linked the cesspit to the plow, the chamber pot to the harvest. And while his name was spoken with disdain in polite company, his work quietly sustained the rhythm of Tudor life. But this trade was not without regulation. Tudor authorities, ever mindful of disease, insisted that Gong Farmers dump waste only in authorized Laistels. The fear of plague loomed constantly over the city, and human filth was seen, not wrongly, as a breeding ground for pestilence. By restricting where it could be deposited, the city hoped to control the spread of illness. Yet, enforcement was often lax. There were always farmers eager for cheap manure, always gong farmers willing to sell directly from their carts, always neighbors ready to look the other way so long as the stink was kept at a distance. This black market of night soil created its own tensions. Some landowners swore by its power, boasting of bumper harvests. Others complained that it poisoned the air, fouled the streams, or carried contagion from the city into the countryside. And still, the trade persisted, for necessity outweighed disgust. In an age before chemical fertilizers, dung was wealth, however loathsome its source. Yet even as filth found its place in the economy, its stench clung to the gong farmer himself. No matter how valuable his cargo, he was never welcome at market stalls or in church pews. His silver might buy bread, but not respect. Neighbors spoke in whispers about how his very presence spoiled the air. Children giggled cruelly, pointing out the way dogs shied from them. Women pinched their noses as he passed. This stigma stretched even to his family. Wives of gong farmers carried the same taint in society's eyes. Sons often inherited the trade, for few others would hire them. Daughters struggled to find suitors, for who wished to marry into a family reeking of cesspits. The shame of the work seeped as deeply into their lives as the stench into their clothing. And yet, some gong farmers lived comfortably. Their wages were higher than those of most common laborers. Their purses clinked with coins after a good week. Some bought land, others small cottages. They might eat better than the carpenter who mocked them or the tailor who refused them service. In private, even their harshest critics admitted, if only to themselves, that without gong farmers, the city would collapse under its own waste. Disease was always the lurking shadow. In the Tudor imagination, foul smells themselves carried illness, the dreaded miasma, the poisoned air that spread plague and fever. A block cesspit was not only a nuisance, but a threat. Households called for gong farmers with increasing urgency when the stench grew overpowering, fearing that sickness would follow if the pit was not cleared. Ironically, the very men believed to carry filth with them were also the ones preventing catastrophe. They were despised saviors, warding off invisible dangers while drowning in visible muck. By the time dawn broke, the carts would be empty, their loads tipped into lay stalls or sold to waiting farmers. The gong farmer's night was done. His arms ached, his clothes clung with filth, his face was drawn with exhaustion. The city would wake, its citizens none the wiser to the labor performed in their sleep. They would step into the streets, relieved of their chamber pots, never pausing to wonder where their refuse had gone, never sparing a thought for the men who had carried it away. And so the gong farmer slipped back into obscurity. His work sustained the cycle of life, yet earned him only scorn. He lived on the margins of Tudor society, both richer and poorer than his neighbors, both necessary and unwanted. He was a man defined by contradictions, bound to a trade that disgusted even as it nourished. But what of the body itself? The toll taken on a man who spent his life in such conditions? What of the lingering sicknesses, the hidden injuries, the slow erosion of health? For while the economy of filth may have profited the farmer in coin, it exacted a price in flesh and bone, in lungs and skin, in years lost to the poison of his own trade. A Tudor gong farmer's life was not measured only in coins earned or pits emptied, but in the slow erosion of health. For though the work paid better than many trades, it exacted a terrible price upon the body. The cesspit was not merely a place of foul smells and filth, it was a chamber of poison. Each descent was a gamble, and the odds rarely favored the farmer. The first and most immediate danger was the air itself. In the blackness of the pit, unseen gases swirled and collected. Ammonia burned the nostrils and stung the eyes until they watered endlessly. Methane, colorless and odorless, choked the lungs, leaving a man gasping for breath. Foul air, the Tudors called it, not knowing the science but well aware of its deadly effect. Men collapsed without warning, their lanterns slipping from their hands, their bodies sinking into the mire. Rescue was dangerous, for the very man who leapt down to save his comrade might be struck senseless in the same instant. Death could come swiftly, without scream or struggle, only a slump into silence. Those who survived faced slower torments. Constant exposure to filth left their skin raw, blistered, and inflamed. The waste burned where it touched, creeping into cuts and scratches, infecting them with unseen rot. Sores lingered for weeks, festering beneath the grime. Hands became calloused, not from honest wood or stone, but from the rough scrape of buckets and the sting of corrosive filth. The stench was another enemy, subtler but no less relentless. It clung to the farmer's hair, his beard, his very breath. Soap and water offered no escape. Vinegar baths dulled it, perfumes masked it, but nothing erased it entirely. Neighbors swore they could smell a Gong Farmer before they saw him. Dogs growled when he passed, unsettled by the alien odor that clung like a second skin. Even his own family lived within its shadow, their clothes and walls infused by association. Then came disease. The Tudor age was already a breeding ground for sickness, with plagues stalking the alleys and fevers rising each summer. For the Gong Farmer, the risk was magnified 100-fold. He handled the waste of hundreds, perhaps thousands, each night. Every bucket might contain the invisible seed of death: dysentery, cholera, typhus. The theory of germs lay centuries ahead, but the reality was inescapable. Many Gong Farmers did not live long enough to grow old. Their bodies broke down from constant assault, their lives shortened by the very filth they removed. And yet, strangely, some survived against all odds. A handful of Gong Farmers grew old, their bodies hardened to the work, their lungs accustomed to the stench. Others believed they had built a kind of immunity, their constant exposure forming a shield against disease. Perhaps luck played its part, or sheer stubbornness. But for most, the work was a slow death sentence, hidden behind the clink of coins. The dangers extended beyond the pit. The journey to the lacetals carried its own perils. A cart heaped with buckets was heavy, unstable, and prone to tipping. Roads were rough, wheels often cracked, axles snapped. A single misstep could spill a night's work onto the street, coating man and cobblestone alike. Worse still, thieves lurked in the shadows. Gong Farmers carried coin, more than a starving man might see in a month, and though few would willingly touch them, desperation drove some to attack. Imagine the bitter irony, to survive a cesspit only to be slain for your wages on the road home. Even in moments of rest, the Gong Farmer found no true peace. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by dreams of drowning in muck, of gasping for air, of endless buckets rising and falling. His back ached, his arms trembled, his joints stiffened before their time. He aged before his years, each night carving another line into his face, and yet he endured. What choice did he have? Few trades welcomed a man once he bore the stink of the cesspit. A farmer's son might find pride in his plow. A mason's apprentice might rise to build cathedrals, but a Gong Farmer's boy inherited the pit. The family carried the curse of filth, passed down like a legacy of shame. A son might swear never to descend, but when hunger gnawed and silver beckoned, down he went, rope around his waist, shovel in hand, into the blackness. This cycle created a strange fraternity among Gong Farmers. They worked in teams, watched one another's backs, drank together in the rare taverns that would admit them. They shared crude jokes to mask the horror, boasted of pits conquered, cursed the fumes that nearly killed them. In a world that shunned them, they found brotherhood in the shadows. They were outcasts together, bound not by honor or craft, but by survival. And society, for all its disdain, could not do without them. The Tudor city thrived on the illusion of cleanliness, but beneath that illusion lay filth, and beneath that filth men who bore its weight. Each pit emptied, each cart hauled, each lacetal filled was a silent act of preservation. Without Gong Farmers, cesspits would overflow, streets would drown in waste, disease would sweep unchecked. They were the hidden guardians of health, despised yet essential, cursed yet indispensable. In time, some found ways to profit beyond wages. A few dealt directly with farmers, selling waste for extra coin. Others struck bargains with innkeepers and landlords, promising swift and discreet service. Still others dabbled in the trade of ash and offal, combining filth into fertilizers of greater value. These men became, in their own grim fashion, entrepreneurs of excrement, but no amount of silver could buy them respect. And so the Gong Farmer lived on the knife's edge, richer than some, poorer than most, alive today, uncertain of tomorrow. His lungs carried poison, his skin bore scars, his name drew scorn. Yet his work sustained a city, fed its fields, and warded off its plagues. He was the most despised man in Tudor England, and perhaps the most necessary. But while the Gong Farmer toiled in filth, others in Tudor society looked upon him with a mixture of disgust and fascination. What did the nobility think of such men? How did common folk speak of them behind closed doors? And what place did religion, morality, and law assign to a trade so unholy, yet so vital? To answer these questions, we must climb out of the pit for a moment and look upon the Gong Farmer through the eyes of the society he served. For all the coins a Gong Farmer earned, for all the nights spent in labor that no one else dared attempt, his reward in society was not respect but revulsion. In the eyes of Tudor England, he was a necessary evil, a figure to be tolerated but never embraced. His presence was endured, not welcomed. His labor was indispensable, but his person was despised. Neighbors whispered as he passed. A carpenter might boast of the wood he shaped. A tailor might proudly display a gown he stitched, but a Gong Farmer could not even admit his trade without drawing sneers. Children laughed cruelly, holding their noses and chanting mocking rhymes. Women crossed the street rather than brush past his sleeve. Men shifted uneasily in taverns, some muttering prayers, others glaring until he withdrew. The stigma clung to his family as tightly as the stench clung to his clothes. A Gong Farmer's wife was regarded with pity at best, disdain at worst. Some believed that living with such a man tainted her virtue, as though the filth of his trade seeped into her soul. Sons inherited not only the trade, but the scorn, branded long before they took up the shovel. Daughters, even the comely ones, found suitors scarce, for who wished to marry into a household forever marked by the stink of cesspits? Religion too cast a shadow. In sermons, priests railed against filth and impurity, drawing symbolic lines between bodily waste and sin. The Gong Farmer became, in some eyes, a walking emblem of corruption. Some whispered that his work made him spiritually unclean, that he carried not only the stench of waste, but the taint of immorality. And yet, in a strange paradox, the church itself required his labor. Monasteries had latrines, abbeys had cesspits, and someone had to clean them. Even holy places depended upon unholy hands. This contradiction was not lost on the Gong Farmer. He knew he was shunned, yet he knew he was needed. Without him, even the richest lord's manor would drown in its own refuse. Without him, the proudest cathedral would fester with stench. He bore his shame in silence, for there was no argument that could erase the disdain of others. The very mention of his name, Gong Farmer, was enough to wrinkle noses and turn heads away. The law recognized his place, but only barely. Regulations dictated where he could work and when, always under cover of darkness, never by day. His very existence was something the city preferred to hide. He was granted license not as a mark of honor, but as a way to keep him at arm's length, a reminder that his trade was to be contained, controlled, and concealed. And yet gossip clung to him like a second cloak. Tales spread of Gong Farmers who grew unexpectedly wealthy, of men who drank fine ale in secret while pretending to be paupers. Some accused them of hoarding, of charging too much for their work, of growing rich off the filth of others. Envy twisted with disgust, making their reputation even more bitter. But perhaps the greatest cruelty was the way they were remembered, or rather, forgotten. The names of craftsmen appeared in guild records. Masons carved their marks into cathedrals. Merchants left ledgers of their trade. Gong Farmers left nothing but silence. No songs praised them, no poems immortalized them, no chronicles lingered on their lives. They were shadows, glimpsed briefly and then dismissed, as though the very memory of their existence was too distasteful to endure. And yet, traces survive in strange places. Court records mention disputes over cesspits, fines for unlawful dumping, accidents where a farmer was overcome by fumes. Parish rolls note their baptisms and burials, though rarely with comment. A few rare wills reveal modest estates, a cottage, a plot of land, some coins left to a wife or child. In these dry fragments, the humanity of the Gong Farmer emerges faintly, like a figure glimpsed through smoke. The contradiction of his life burned most fiercely at festivals and gatherings. On holy days, when neighbors feasted together, he was often absent, either by choice or exclusion. If he did appear, he sat on the margins, eating in silence while others laughed at a distance. At fairs, where tradesmen displayed their crafts, he had nothing to show, for his work was invisible once done. At weddings, his presence was sometimes refused outright, lest his odor offend the guests. Even in death, his grave was no grand marker of service, but a simple mound, often untended, the name of the man fading as quickly as the stench of his labor. And yet, despite all this, there lingered a grudging acknowledgment, unspoken but understood. When cesspits overflowed, when streets reeked, when disease threatened, it was not the carpenter or tailor or merchant who answered the call. It was the Gong Farmer. The very men mocked by day were the ones summoned in desperation by night. And though no thanks were offered and no respect given, there was a moment, brief, fleeting, and usually unspoken, when neighbors admitted the truth to themselves. Without him, we would be lost. Thus, the Gong Farmer lived in the strange twilight of Tudor society, visible yet invisible, hated yet needed, despised yet indispensable. His life was a mirror held up to the contradictions of his age, a society that prided itself on civility yet depended on men crawling through cesspits, a church that preached purity yet relied on those who waded in filth, a people who craved cleanliness yet shunned the cleaners themselves. But what of the world above him, the lords and ladies, the courtiers and monarchs? How did the highest ranks of Tudor society regard the men who bore their waste away? To answer that, we must climb from the alleys of towns to the gilded halls of palaces, where velvet and perfume masked the same human needs, and where even kings, for all their majesty, relied upon the unseen hands of the Gong Farmer. When we think of Tudor palaces, we imagine glittering halls, the gleam of candlelight on gilded walls, ladies in silks and men in velvet, the scent of rosewater drifting from polished courtyards. But beneath that surface, quite literally beneath the polished stone floors, lurked the same human reality as in any common tavern: waste. The grandeur of Hampton Court, the majesty of Whitehall, the stern dignity of the Tower of London, all of them, for all their wealth and beauty, relied on latrines, privies, and cesspits. Even kings and queens, though they sat on thrones and ruled empires, could not escape the needs of the body. And where there was waste, there were Gong Farmers. Imagine the paradox. In one chamber, King Henry VIII feasted on roasted boar, spiced wine, and sugared confections, surrounded by courtiers who bowed low and praised his majesty. In another chamber, not far below, a Gong Farmer crouched in the darkness of a brick-lined vault, shoveling the remains of that very feast after it had passed through royal bowels. The pomp of monarchy and the filth of humanity coexisted, one stacked atop the other like layers of a grotesque cake. In noble households, Gong Farmers were treated with even more secrecy than in towns. Their work was vital but scandalous, and noble pride demanded that such necessities remain hidden. Servants ushered them in discreetly, often at night, sometimes through side gates or back courtyards. They labored unseen, and when their work was done, they were dismissed quickly, paid in coin, but never in courtesy. The courtiers themselves, obsessed with appearances, avoided even acknowledging such men. To admit their existence was to admit that the court, for all its perfumes and silks, was no cleaner, no purer than the meanest alley, and so they pretended. They spoke of gardens, of banquets, of hunts, but not of cesspits. They praised the king's wisdom, his might, his majesty, but never whispered of the men who cleaned the king's waste. And yet the labor of Gong Farmers in palaces may have been the most dangerous of all. Royal households housed hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, nobles, guards, servants, cooks, musicians, clerks, and attendants. The sheer volume of waste was staggering. Privies overflowed faster, pits filled more quickly, and the risk of disease spread more widely. Gong Farmers in these places worked under immense pressure, their tasks urgent and constant. A delay in clearing could mean stench spreading through chambers, flies buzzing in feasting halls, or worse, the outbreak of deadly plague among the courtiers. And what of the monarchs themselves? How did they regard the men who kept their palaces clean? The truth is, they probably gave them little thought at all. kings and queens of the Tudor age were raised to believe in hierarchy and divine order. To them, a gong farmer was simply a man at the bottom of the chain, a necessary drudge, no more worth their attention than the rats scurrying in the kitchens. If they ever considered his existence, it was fleeting, a passing annoyance quickly forgotten. Yet the irony is sharp. Henry VIII, with all his power, depended daily on men who worked in filth. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, whose court prided itself on refinement, owed her glittering entertainments in part to gong farmers laboring unseen. Even the most exalted monarch could not escape the reality that their luxury was built on the backs of men crouching in pits with shovels. For the gong farmers themselves, palace work brought both opportunity and risk. The pay could be higher, for noble households had deeper purses. A farmer who worked for the court might earn enough to buy land, a cottage, perhaps even free his family from want. But with wealth came whispers. Some accused them of carrying secrets from inside the palace, of overhearing words not meant for common ears. Others suspected them of knowing too much about the private lives of nobles, for who else had access to chambers so intimate, so hidden? A careless word from a gong farmer could, in theory, bring scandal. For this reason, their silence was prized as much as their shovels, but silence was not always enough. In rare cases, palace gong farmers became pawns in political games. There are hints, though records are scarce, of men questioned about what they saw or heard, of cesspits searched for discarded letters, tokens, even bodies. For in a world where intrigue ran deep, even waste might conceal secrets. The cesspit was not only a place of filth, but a hiding place for shameful things. It is tempting to imagine that some gong farmers, trudging home after a night's work in the bowels of Hampton Court, allowed themselves a bitter smile. For while nobles strutted in jewels and feathers and courtiers flattered with honeyed words, it was the gong farmer who knew the truth most intimately, that beneath the silks and perfumes, beneath the crowns and titles, all men were the same. This unspoken knowledge gave their work a strange dignity, though unrecognized. They were witnesses to the great leveling force of nature. They shoveled, they hauled, they endured the stench, and in doing so, they reminded, if only to themselves, that kings and peasants alike shared the same fate when it came to the needs of the body. Thus, the gong farmer in noble service stood at a strange crossroads, despised yet indispensable, silenced yet privy to secrets, hidden yet ever present. He was the invisible servant of kings, the shadow that haunted palaces, the reminder that even in the highest halls of power, filth lurked just beneath the surface. But what happened when their work went wrong, when cesspits overflowed, when the stench could no longer be hidden, when disease seeped from filth into the bloodstream of the city? That is where the story of the gong farmer turns from secret necessity to public crisis, and where the true weight of their labor reveals itself. The Tudor world was always teetering on the edge of sickness. Cities were crowded, water was foul, animals roamed the streets, and waste was everywhere. A cesspit that filled too quickly, or a privy left uncleared, could turn from a private inconvenience into a public disaster. For when the pits overflowed, the entire neighborhood suffered. Picture a summer in Tudor London, the air already heavy with the smell of fish from the Thames, the smoke of coal fires, the sweat of unwashed bodies. Now imagine the stench of a cesspit that had not been emptied. At first, it was a subtle sourness wafting through the alleys, but within days it grew sharp and gagging. Flies swarmed, buzzing in black clouds over the surface. Rats, bold and fat, ran along walls. Children gagged as they passed, holding claws over their noses. And then, inevitably, the sickness came. Overflowing pits leached filth into wells, seeped under foundations, and spilled into open drains. The waste carried with it invisible killers, bacteria, parasites, the seeds of dysentery, cholera, and the dreaded plague. Neighbors might not see the connection, but the gong farmers knew. They had worked in pits that bubbled with methane, that hissed with decay, that seemed alive with corruption. They had seen how quickly a foul smell in the night turned into death in the morning. When outbreaks came, suspicion often fell on the poorest, the beggars in the streets, the foreigners at the docks, the vagrants in churchyards. But those who labored in cesspits knew another truth. The waste itself was the breeding ground. They knew it in their lungs when they coughed after a night's work, in their stomachs when they carried the stench home with them, in the fevers that struck their own families. They were not physicians, but they were witnesses to the raw, festering heart of the city's disease. In such times, gong farmers were in higher demand than ever. Parishes and city councils, desperate to stem outbreaks, ordered cesspits cleared with urgency. Men were hired at short notice, paid extra coin to descend into pits before dawn, to shovel night after night until every vault was scraped clean. But with greater demand came greater danger, for it was in the worst pits, the ones left too long, that the risk was greatest. The records tell of gong farmers struck dead in the act. Men who climbed down ladders only to collapse, suffocated by toxic fumes rising from the waste. Some were dragged out unconscious, revived with strong drink and fresh air. Others never rose again. The phrase, drowned in filth, was not always a metaphor. There were men who slipped, men who fainted, and men who never climbed back up. And yet, without them, the city would have choked. Imagine London in the reign of Elizabeth I without its gong farmers. Thousands upon thousands of residents, each producing waste every day with nowhere for it to go. The Thames already bore the burden of butcher's blood, dyer's chemicals, and the refuse of markets. Add to that the unchecked overflow of human cesspits, and the river would have become an open sewer of death. Gong farmers were not praised as heroes, but in truth they kept the city alive. There were moments when their importance could not be denied. During the plague years, when death carts rattled through the streets and bells tolled without pause, cesspits were cleared with frantic speed. Priests prayed, physicians bled their patients, but it was the gong farmers who dealt with one of the plague's root causes, filth itself. By hauling away the waste, they removed the breeding grounds of rats and fleas, the hidden sources of contagion. Still, the irony lingered. The men who risked the most to keep others safe were the ones most despised. Neighbors avoided them even when they saved whole streets from ruin. Some whispered that the gong farmers themselves carried disease, that their stench poisoned the air, that their very breath was dangerous. And so, though they labored to protect the city, they were met not with gratitude but with suspicion. One can almost hear the bitterness in their silence. Imagine a gong farmer trudging home at dawn after a night spent knee-deep in filth, having hauled away tons of waste from an overflowing pit. As he passed neighbors, they turned their faces, covered their noses, muttered insults under their breath. And yet, without his labor, their children might already be dead of dysentery. The injustice must have burned, but he swallowed it, for silence was part of the trade. What history leaves us, then, is a paradox. The Tudor world viewed gong farmers as untouchable, as men to be shunned. But at the same time, when filth threatened to consume the city, they were the first called. In the shadows of overflowing pits, in the feverish streets of plague-stricken London, gong farmers were both outcasts and saviors. Their job was not simply to shovel waste. It was to hold back the tide of disease, to scrape away death itself, to keep the city standing on its rotting foundations. And though no statues were raised in their honor, and no songs were sung of their labor, the truth is plain: without gong farmers, Tudor London might well have fallen to its own filth. To understand the life of a gong farmer, one must step into the darkness with him, into the cesspit itself. Imagine lowering yourself down a wooden ladder, lantern in one hand, the other hand gripping the rungs slick with damp. The air grows thicker as you descend. The smell is suffocating, an acrid mixture of rot, ammonia, and methane. The brick walls glisten with moisture. At the bottom, your boots sink into the muck, and the task begins. What did a gong farmer carry with him into that pit? His survival depended on it. The most essential tool was the long-handled shovel. It was crude, heavy, and built for endurance, its iron blade hammered by blacksmiths who knew it would not be used on soil, but on something far fouler. The handle was long not for comfort, but for necessity, allowing the farmer to reach deep into corners without submerging himself too far. Alongside the shovel, there were buckets of thick wood, bound with iron hoops, designed to withstand not only the weight of the muck, but also its corrosive wetness. Ropes were another necessity. Buckets filled in the dark had to be hauled up to the surface by assistants above, who tied them off, emptied them into carts, and lowered them again. The creak of rope over pulley, the thud of waste hitting the cart, the clatter of iron hoops, these were the sounds that marked a gong farmer's night. Light was scarce. Candles guttered and went out in the choking air. Oil lamps, their flames shielded with glass, were carried instead. But even they were dangerous, for in some pits the gases were so strong that a single spark might ignite them. There are grim tales of farmers whose lamps set fire to the very air, the pit erupting in sudden flame like the mouth of hell. Thus, men learned to test the air cautiously, lowering lamps slowly, watching how the flame behaved, sometimes even sending a bird down first as a grim measure of safety. And what of their clothing? Gong farmers dressed not for display but for survival. They wore coarse wool or leather, clothing that could endure filth and be scrubbed, though the stench never truly left. Some covered their faces with rags soaked in vinegar or herbs, believing the sharpness of the scent would ward off sickness. Others pulled hoods low, not to hide from neighbors, but to keep dripping filth from their hair and eyes. Boots were heavy, often greased against rot, but many men tied sacks around their legs, knowing that sooner or later everything they wore would be ruined. Perhaps the strangest tool of all was silence. Gong farmers did not call out as they worked. Words were wasted in the foul air, and besides, their trade was shrouded in secrecy. They descended quietly, shoveled quietly, and emerged quietly, as though the city itself wished to forget their presence. Only the creak of the rope and the splash of the shovel marked their passing. It was not only the physical tools that mattered, but also the mental ones. Endurance, above all, was essential. To labor for hours in darkness, surrounded by filth, lungs aching from the stench, stomach heaving from the closeness, it required a strength of mind that few could understand. Many men could not bear it. Apprentices quit after a single night, vowing never to return. Only those who could master their disgust, who could harden themselves against the filth, lasted in the trade. Yet there were tricks of the craft. A seasoned gong farmer knew how to pace himself, shoveling steadily, not too fast lest he tire, not too slow lest the job drag into dawn. He knew when to climb up for a breath of fresh air, when to lean his weight against the shovel, when to let the rope team above take the strain. He knew the sounds of a pit, the hollow splash that meant it was nearly empty, the dull slop that warned of thicker layers below, the faint bubbling that suggested dangerous gases. To outsiders it was filth. To him it was a language. When the buckets were hauled up, they were loaded onto carts lined with straw. These carts rolled through the silent streets toward the fields outside the city. There, the waste was spread as fertilizer, steaming in the dawn light, feeding crops that would one day feed the very people who scorned the men who had carried it. Thus the circle of filth completed itself, from table to body, from body to pit, from pit to field, from field back to table. And the gong farmer was its hidden hand. For all their tools, for all their knowledge, one thing they never truly mastered was the stench. No vinegar rag, no perfumed herb, no heavy wool could keep it at bay. It seeped into skin, into hair, into the very breath of the man. Neighbors said you could smell a gong farmer before you saw him, that the stench clung no matter how often he bathed. For some, it became a mark, a badge of disgrace. For others, it was simply the price of survival. In the end, the gong farmer's tools were not symbols of mastery, but of endurance. The shovel, the bucket, the rope, the lamp, each was a reminder of his place in the great, grim machinery of the city. He was not celebrated for his skill. His tools were not polished or displayed. They were used, dirtied, worn down, and replaced, like the man himself. And yet, without them, the city could not stand. Without the creak of the rope, the scrape of the shovel, the clatter of buckets, the Tudor world would have drowned in its own filth. The gong farmer's tools, humble and foul though they were in truth the very tools of civilization. The gong farmer was not a man of daylight. His world belonged to the night, to hours when the city slumbered, when respectable folk drew their shutters and banked their hearths, when silence settled over alleys and courtyards. For it was in darkness that his work began. By law and custom, Gong farmers worked only after dusk. This was not mere convenience. It was deliberate concealment. No one wished to see carts piled with human waste trundling through busy streets, nor men climbing out of cesspits with faces blackened by filth. The sight was too stark a reminder of what lay beneath the surface of Tudor life. So the Gong farmer became a creature of the night, emerging only when the city turned its face away. Their routine was strict, dictated by the turning of the sun. At dusk, they gathered their tools, shovels, buckets, ropes, lanterns, and loaded carts with straw for lining. Wrapped in heavy clothes, faces hidden behind vinegar-soaked rags, they set out toward the first pit. The streets were different then. Without the clamor of markets, without the cries of hawkers or the rumble of wagons, the city seemed ghostly. Footsteps echoed louder, whispers carried further. The only sounds were the creak of cart wheels, the hiss of lantern flames, and the occasional bark of a dog unsettled by their passing. The Gong farmers moved with practiced silence. They did not call to one another in the street for fear of waking householders. They communicated with gestures, with the thump of buckets, with the pull of ropes. Even their carts rolled softly, straw muffling the slosh of their loads. It was as though they conspired with the night itself, working unseen, unacknowledged. At each household they slipped through side gates, sometimes led in by servants sworn to secrecy. A ladder was lowered, a lamp hung above, and one by one the men descended into the pit. Hours might pass before the vault was emptied, the buckets rising and falling in endless rhythm. Above, the cart filled steadily, its straw sodden and steaming. By the time they moved on, the first gray light of dawn might already be showing. For the Gong farmer, the night was long and exhausting. The work was heavy, the air foul, and the stench unrelenting. But it was also strangely monotonous. Each pit was like the last, brick walls slick with damp, layers of waste compacted by years of use, the same suffocating silence broken only by shovel and rope. The routine became a kind of grim music. Shovel, lift, pour, shovel, lift, pour. Hours blurred, nights blurred, years blurred. And yet there was something eerie about their passage through the city. Imagine standing at your window in the dead of night, hearing the creak of a cart and the shuffle of boots on cobblestone. You peer out, and in the lantern's glow, you see shadowed figures bent beneath the weight of buckets, faces hidden, clothes smeared. You smell a stench carried on the breeze. And then they are gone, swallowed by darkness, leaving only silence behind. For most Londoners, this was their only glimpse of the Gong farmers, fleeting, spectral, half-believed. To children, they were boogeymen. Parents warned them to behave, lest the Gong men take them away at night. To drunks staggering home, they were shadows best avoided, men whose very breath was poison. To neighbors, they were an unpleasant necessity, endured but not welcomed. And to the farmers themselves, the night was both a cloak and a curse. It hid them from shame, but it also bound them to secrecy, to a life lived in half-light. When dawn approached, their procession turned toward the city gates. By law, waste could not be dumped within the walls. Carts rattled out into the countryside, past hedges silvered with dew, toward fields waiting for fertilizer. There, the night's harvest was spread across the soil, steaming as the first sun touched it. Birds wheeled overhead, pecking at scraps. Farmers nodded grimly, knowing their crops depended on this foul bounty. And then, with carts emptied, the Gong farmers returned. Homecoming was no less secretive than their labor. They slipped into their cottages at the edge of town, away from respectable neighbors, away from prying eyes. Clothes were scrubbed in cold water, though the stench clung stubbornly. Some bathed, some collapsed directly onto beds of straw, too weary to care. Their day began not with work, but with sleep, curtains drawn against the morning. While others bustled in daylight, Gong farmers lay in darkness, their lives reversed, their routines bound forever to the shadows. The cycle repeated, night after night, year after year. There was no season when waste ceased, no festival when cesspits stopped filling. Christmas feasts only made their work heavier, plague years only made it more urgent. The city could not pause in its need, and so neither could they. Thus, the Gong Farmer's life was one of endless nights, endless shadows, endless secrecy. His was a routine not measured by seasons or festivals, but by pits emptied and fields fertilized. He was the night's laborer, the unseen servant of a city that despised him, the shadow that passed while others slept. And in that endless routine lay the strange, haunting rhythm of his existence: silence, filth, and the creak of wheels beneath the stars. As the Tudor sun rose sluggishly over the rooftops, life for the Gong Farmer was only just winding down. He would emerge from the pits as dawn's pale light stretched across the sky, his face ghostly in the early hours, his clothes reeking despite being scrubbed in the nearest ditch water. Yet, while others prepared for a day of baking, brewing, weaving, or hawking goods in the market square, the Gong Farmer prepared for something far different: an audience with those who would rather not look him in the eye. Payment was always an awkward affair. No one wished to linger in his company for long. When he came knocking at the side doors of taverns, monasteries, or households, coin was often dropped hastily into his palm with eyes averted. The coins themselves seemed to carry the taint of his work, as though the very metal had absorbed the stench. He was rarely allowed through the front door, no matter how vital his work had been. Instead, he was treated like the refuse he removed necessary, but unwanted. And yet, for all the coldness he received, he wielded a strange kind of power. Imagine a bustling Tudor inn, filled with travelers drinking ale, the fire blazing merrily. Beneath the floorboards, unseen by the revelers, lay a cesspit that, if neglected, could overflow into the very rooms where men feasted. Disease could spread swiftly. An inn could be closed, its reputation destroyed. The Gong Farmer's work kept such establishments alive. His shovel and his bucket were the silent guardians of health. Still, no amount of importance could cleanse him of the stigma. Children would sometimes throw stones at him when he walked by. The bravest or the cruelest would shout insults, calling him a dung man or worse. If he retaliated, he risked trouble with the constable, for in Tudor England a man of low status was seldom given the benefit of justice. He learned instead to walk with his head bowed, his pace steady, pretending the jibes did not reach him. But what did it do to a man's spirit, to be both needed and despised, to carry the health of a community on his back while being denied respect? It is said that some Gong Farmers grew bitter, retreating into silence and isolation. Others, oddly enough, wore their profession with a kind of rough pride, boasting that no gentleman could last a single night in the pit. For them, the disgust of others was proof of their own resilience. They could do what no one else dared. The law, too, played its role in shaping their lives. Under Tudor regulations, Gong Farmers were required to work only at night. By dawn, their presence was supposed to be erased, their work hidden, the streets restored to cleanliness before honest folk stirred from their beds. This meant their existence was one of shadows. While neighbors talked over fences in daylight or congregated in parish yards, the Gong Farmer remained indoors, waiting for evening to fall so he could descend again into the filth. He became, in many ways, invisible, seen only when mocked, remembered only when needed. Yet there were moments when invisibility served him well. In the stillness of the night, moving from house to house, he became a witness to things others never saw. He might overhear whispered conversations through open windows, catch the flicker of illicit meetings in alleys, or stumble across the discarded remains of feasts left behind by careless nobles. To walk the streets at night was to step into another world, one of secrecy, silence, and shadows. But secrecy had its dangers. There were tales of Gong Farmers being accused of theft, simply because they were the only souls awake when mischief was done. A missing trinket, a vanished purse suspicion could fall on the dung collector who had passed nearby. To be poor was to live always under a cloud of doubt. And though some were guilty, most simply carried their buckets, too weary and too filthy to bother with the baubles of others. Despite the hardships, there was coin to be made, and sometimes more than coin. Farmers in need of fertilizer might offer food, ale, or even clothing in exchange for the night's harvest of waste. The Gong Farmer's cart, though foul, was filled with something valuable to the earth. What others threw away, he transformed into barter, into bread for his table. The irony was bitter but undeniable. The stuff of shame was also the stuff of survival. Still, survival did not come without cost. His body bore the marks of his work. The stench clung to his skin no matter how he scrubbed. His lungs, after years of inhaling foul air, rasped and wheezed in his sleep. His hands, once steady and strong, grew raw from the damp and the filth. Some men lasted only a few years in the trade before sickness drove them out or drove them into the ground. Others endured for decades, their names forgotten, their labor unspoken, their only legacy the cleanliness they left behind. And what a family! For some, the Gong Farmer's coin was enough to secure a modest living, to keep wives and children clothed and fed. But children were often ashamed of their father's work, and daughters found it difficult to marry when others whispered of the smell that clung to their household. To be born into the family of a Gong Farmer was to inherit a shadow, one that followed long after the pits were emptied. The paradox of his life was stark. He walked among men, but was never truly with them. He performed the service that sustained their health, their comfort, their daily lives, and yet he lived on the fringes. Half ghost, half outcast, his worth measured only in the absence of disaster. If he did his job well, no one spoke his name. If he failed, all cursed him. This was the Gong Farmer's burden, to bear the weight of waste, of secrecy, of stigma, and still rise each night to descend again into the depths. The Tudor world depended on him, though it pretended it did not. His was a life shaped not only by filth, but by contradiction, needed, despised, hidden, and yet essential. If there was one thing that haunted the Tudor imagination more than the specter of hunger or poverty, it was disease. Plague had stalked England for centuries, striking in waves that no one could predict, sweeping through towns with merciless speed. And when plague arrived, suspicion fell quickly upon the foul-smelling miasmas that rose from stagnant ditches, overflowing middens, and neglected cesspits. The Gong Farmer then stood on the front line of a silent war, though no one would have called him a soldier. He was a man laboring in the trenches of sanitation, removing the very waste that many believed carried sickness on its breath. In taverns and parish sermons alike, people whispered of the bad airs that rose from dung and rot. These airs, they thought, seeped into the lungs and poisoned the blood. It was not the unseen flea or the hidden bacterium they feared, it was the stench itself, heavy and choking, that seemed to herald death. Thus, the Gong Farmer became a figure bound to both revulsion and dread. His work touched the very heart of people's fears. For when he descended into the pit, he did not simply battle filth, he wrestled with the very vapors that were thought to kill. His survival seemed almost unnatural. How could a man breathe such corruption nightly and yet return alive? Some whispered he was cursed, others that he was hardened by sin, his soul already half dead. In reality, his survival was no miracle. Many of his fellows did not live long at all. The risks were manifold. A poorly braced pit might collapse, burying a man alive in the very muck he had come to remove. The gases that gathered below methane, ammonia, hydrogen sulfide were invisible killers. One careless breath could cause dizziness, unconsciousness, or death before his fellows could haul him out. There are tales in city records of Gong Farmers found slumped at the bottom of cesspits, buckets still in hand, claimed by the air they had stirred. Their deaths were rarely honored. A brief note in a parish register might record them, but no bell was rung for the dung man. And then there were the slower deaths, the lingering illnesses that ate away at a man year by year. Constant exposure to waste brought fevers, sores, and chronic coughs. Their teeth rotted early, their eyes grew red and inflamed, and their skin often carried eruptions from constant contact with filth. Many Tudor trades were dangerous. Miners suffocated, smiths burned, sailors drowned, but the Gong Farmer bore a unique kind of peril, one that worked its way into his body silently, unseen, like the very diseases people so feared. This connection to sickness stained his reputation further. In times of plague, when death carts rolled through the streets, it was not uncommon for the desperate and the superstitious to blame the Gong Farmers themselves. Had they not stirred up the foul airs that poisoned the city? Had they not touched the very matter from which pestilence was thought to rise? A man who dealt in dung was easy to cast as a culprit, even though his labor likely reduced the very dangers he was accused of spreading. The irony is cruel. Without him, filth would overflow, streets would reek, and disease would surely spread faster. Yet, when death swept through, he was branded a harbinger of it. In the minds of many, the line between cleaning waste and conjuring pestilence blurred. The Gong Farmer lived in this shadow constantly, needed when health prevailed, accused when sickness struck. Imagine the isolation this bred. A Gong Farmer could not join the laughter in an alehouse without glances of suspicion. He could not walk into a church pew without whispers at his back. He was marked by his work, and in a society where death hovered always near, that mark was heavy. And yet, for all the stigma, there was a dark sort of practicality to his trade. Lords and magistrates knew well that without Gong Farmers, their cities would drown in their own waste. And so, even when suspicion burned hottest, the work continued. The pits were emptied, the night carts rumbled through the lanes, and the Gong Farmer carried on because no one else would dare. But one cannot help but wonder, what thoughts must have plagued the Gong Farmer himself as he coughed from the fumes, as he buried companions who had fallen to the gases, as he endured yet another sermon blaming foul men for the sickness of the age? Did he ever see himself as a man saving lives, or only as one cursed to carry death upon his shoulders? Perhaps it was both. The Gong Farmer lived on the edge of life and death, at the threshold between health and sickness, between cleanliness and corruption. He was both protector and pariah, savior and scapegoat. In his buckets he carried not just waste, but the anxieties of an entire people who both feared and depended upon him. And so his nights stretched on down into the pits, up with the dawn, his lungs filled with air that might kill, his body marked by toil that few could bear. Every shovelful was a gamble, every breath a wager against the unseen. For in Tudor England, death was never far, but for the Gong Farmer, it was always just beneath his feet. The life of a Gong Farmer was not limited to private households. As cities grew, as monasteries expanded, and as castles and fortresses demanded sanitation, the scale of their labor grew as well. The work was no longer just about discreetly emptying a single privy or cesspit. It became a monumental, citywide task, a grim orchestration of labor and logistics that few outsiders could imagine. Consider London, bustling with traders, artisans, and residents. Every day, thousands produced waste, and every night it accumulated in pits beneath homes, inns, and workshops. To manage this, the city relied on the expertise of professional Gong Farmers. Some were contracted for entire parishes, responsible for multiple pits, privies, and midden heaps. Their work was organized in shifts, almost militaristic in precision, for the city could not afford mistakes. Overflowing waste could block streets, spread disease, and even halt trade. In essence, the Gong Farmer was a guardian of urban function, though no one honored him as such. Monasteries, too, required the service of Gong Farmers. These religious houses, often large and populated by dozens of monks, novices, and servants, produced vast amounts of waste. Abbeys like Westminster or Glastonbury maintained systems of vaulted privies, but these needed constant clearing. Monks, dedicated to prayer and work, had no interest in wading through human filth. They hired Gong Farmers, men who descended into the underground labyrinths beneath the cloisters, cleaning what others dared not touch. The irony was sharp. Holy men, devoted to purity of soul, depended entirely on men whose hands were immersed in every imaginable impurity. Castles and palaces were yet another theater for this grim labor. These structures housed hundreds, sometimes thousands, of residents, each requiring sanitation. Some castles even had multi-level privy systems, where waste was funneled into massive stone pits. Clearing them demanded skill, strength, and endurance. It was a precise art. Shoveling too quickly could topple the walls of a pit. Shoveling too slowly risked overflow. A mistake could ruin a banquet, make a lord's chamber unbearable, or worse, bring disease to the elite who resided above. The logistics of the work were staggering. Carts had to be moved through narrow streets at night, carefully avoiding disturbing households. Waste had to be transported to designated dumping grounds, often miles away from the city. Buckets and shovels had to be scrubbed, or at least cleaned enough to last another night. Rope teams coordinated the raising of heavy loads from deep pits. Every movement was choreographed, every step calculated. A single misstep could result in injury or disaster. Yet despite the scale, the Gong Farmer remained invisible to those he served. City councils might negotiate payment, abbots might issue instructions, but in daily life he was never invited to dine with those he served, never praised in council minutes, never given the respect due to the scale of his labor. His work was essential, yet it remained unspoken, a secret carried in buckets, ropes, and buckets of filth. The variety of work also meant a variety of skills. Some Gong farmers specialized in deep pits, others in privy maintenance, still others in transporting the waste over long distances. Experienced men could read the composition of a pit by the smell alone, knowing whether the contents were fresh or compacted, whether they would rise easily or resist removal. Some could even predict structural weaknesses in the pit walls, a crucial skill for avoiding collapse. To the untrained eye, it was all the same filth. To the professional, it was a complex puzzle of biology, engineering, and stamina. Interestingly, some Gong farmers accumulated wealth over time. By working for large estates, monasteries, or cities, they could earn more than simple household laborers, enough to afford small plots of land, sturdy cottages, or the occasional luxury, yet wealth brought little social capital. No matter how much coin he earned, the Gong farmer remained a figure of revulsion, his profession staining him socially even as it enriched him economically. The smell clung to him, and so did the prejudice. Even a wealthy Gong farmer could not dine at the mayoress table or marry easily into a respectable family. And yet, for all the danger, the labor, and the social stigma, the work continued because someone had to do it. Cities grew, monasteries flourished, and castles stood strong only because the pits were cleared, the waste removed, and the fields outside fertilized. The Gong farmer, in his unsung, uncelebrated labor, sustained life itself in a society that denied him acknowledgement. He was the silent backbone of Tudor urban and rural life, the hidden hand that prevented the collapse of hygiene, health, and productivity. Every pit emptied, every cart hauled to the fields, every night survived, was a testament not only to human endurance but to the interdependence of society. Nobles, clergy, townsfolk, merchants, and peasants alike depended on his work, whether they knew it or not. And yet, for all this importance, he remained invisible, walking through a world that feared and despised him, returning each night to the darkness he knew too well. The magnitude of the Gong farmer's work is hard to imagine today. Modern sanitation systems have made us forget the labor, the skill, and the danger that once sustained human life. But in Tudor England, his profession was nothing less than essential. Without him, the city would have faltered, monasteries would have stunk, castles would have become uninhabitable, and the diseases of filth would have spread unchecked. And so, in the silent, dark nights, with shovel in hand and lantern glowing dimly against brick and stone, the Gong farmer moved from pit to pit, house to house, parish to parish. His was a life of scale and endurance, a life measured not in applause but in survival, a life that bound together the filth and the grandeur of Tudor England in ways few ever understood. If there is one unexpected truth about Tudor England, it is that human excrement was not just waste, it was wealth. While the streets and pits reeked and society scorned the men who handled it, the waste itself was a commodity of undeniable value. The Gong farmer, by laboring in the darkness, became a vital link in a hidden economy, one that transformed filth into sustenance. Once the pits were emptied, the buckets of waste were carefully loaded onto carts. Straw was often laid down first to absorb moisture and prevent leakage, and the heavy, steaming loads were tied securely with ropes. The Gong farmer, sometimes accompanied by assistants, guided the cart through the narrow, silent streets, past shuttered houses, past the dogs and cats of neighbors who sniffed and scurried away. Every wheel creak and bucket rattle announced a presence that the city wished it could forget. The journey was not short. Waste had to be transported to fields outside the city walls, often miles away. These fields awaited the precious cargo, for human excrement was a fertilizer of unmatched potency. Farmers paid handsomely for it, knowing that it enriched the soil, improved crop yields, and made life possible for townsfolk dependent on fresh vegetables, grains, and fodder. What society scorned, nature embraced. The very substance that made the Gong farmer a figure of revulsion was, paradoxically, a cornerstone of survival. Along the way, the smell clung like a shadow. No matter how tightly buckets were secured or how carefully the load was covered, a pungent aroma escaped, announcing to the countryside that the Gong farmer had passed. Villagers might wrinkle their noses, children might cry out, dogs bark, but the carts rolled on. The stink was a small price to pay for the fertility it delivered. Yet for the men guiding these carts, it was a constant companion, pressing into their lungs, their hair, their clothes. No cloth, no vinegar, no wool could fully repel it. At the fields, the process began anew. The waste was spread across the soil, sometimes mixed with straw or composted to reduce its raw potency. Farmers marveled at the difference it made: greener crops, richer grains, faster-growing vegetables. Without this excrement, entire harvests could fail, particularly in cities where the soil had long been worked and depleted. In this way, the Gong farmer became an invisible hand feeding the nation, his night's labor rippling through the economy, through markets, and into kitchens across England. Some Gong farmers found ways to profit beyond their wages. A cartload of high-quality pit waste could be sold to different estates, or carefully reserved for wealthier farmers who demanded the best fertilizer. In rare cases, the man who emptied the pits also negotiated deals with market gardeners, turning the very product of his loathed labor into additional coin. Though he was socially despised, he could accumulate a measure of economic power, small, hidden, and often resented, but real nonetheless. This system was not without its dangers. Transporting waste over long distances meant navigating rutted roads, uneven tracks, and unpredictable weather. Rain could wash filth from carts into ditches, creating complaints from landowners or neighbors. Mud slowed wheels, forcing the men to push with all their strength. Horses used to haul heavier loads, sometimes balked, slipping in the muck or startling at the stench. Every journey demanded skill, patience, and brute endurance. One wrong move could mean loss of the load, injury, or even sickness from accidental exposure. Despite the hardships, the economic significance of the Gong farmer's work could not be overstated. Markets depended on his labor. Crops fed the poor and the wealthy alike. Gardens bloomed, grain swelled, and livestock fattened on fields fertilized by the very waste he transported. Without him, the delicate balance of Tudor agriculture would have faltered. Waste, despised and feared, was in truth one of the most valuable resources of the age. And yet, recognition remained elusive. Farmers might pay for his product, magistrates might contract his service, but no one praised him. His work was a secret celebrated only in results: a green harvest, a full granary, a thriving field. The Gong farmer himself remained invisible, moving between cesspits and fields. Night after night, his contribution acknowledged only in the silent gratitude of the soil. This duality defined the profession, reviled in society, yet essential to life itself, surrounded by decay, yet producing growth, enduring stink and scorn, yet shaping the very foundation of sustenance. He was a man whose labor turned death into life, filth into food, revulsion into necessity. In the quiet of the fields, under early morning skies, the Gong farmer might pause for a moment to catch his breath. Perhaps he gazed at the soil, at the shoots of green that rose from last night's deposits. Perhaps he understood, in a deep and private way, the strange power of his work, the ability to nourish an entire community while remaining unseen, uncelebrated, almost forgotten. It was a life lived in extremes, intense labor, constant stench, social isolation, yet undeniable economic and ecological importance. The Gong farmer's world was one of paradoxes, of necessity woven into disgust, and of survival built on endurance. And so, day after day, night after night, he carried on, a silent agent of growth and decay, a man who transformed human waste into sustenance, whose labor fed a nation even as it condemned him to the shadows. The life of a Gong farmer was not one learned in books or sermons. It was learned in darkness by hands raw and lungs accustomed to stench. Apprenticeships were the only way to enter the trade, and they were as rigorous as they were grim. Fathers often passed the craft to sons, older farmers trained younger ones, and knowledge was transferred hand to hand, shovel to shovel, pit to pit. A young apprentice would start by observing. He watched the older men descend into pits, noting how they tested the air with a lamp before lowering themselves fully, how they adjusted their posture to avoid slipping, and how they wielded the shovel in rhythm with the rising and falling buckets. He learned which pits were stable, which corners held dangerous gases, which piles of waste were easiest to remove. Observation was the first lesson. Survival depended upon it. Next came hands-on work, though cautiously. At first, the apprentice might hold a bucket or push a cart, keeping a safe distance from the deepest muck. Gradually, he would learn to wield the shovel, to scrape walls without disturbing the pit's structure, to avoid inhaling dangerous fumes, to time the raising of buckets with the assistance above. The work demanded both strength and finesse. One slip could mean injury or even death. One misjudged movement could collapse walls or spill a load into a cart. Training was as much about discipline as it was about skill. Family traditions often dictated the path of a Gong farmer's life. Sons followed fathers, nephews followed uncles, apprentices became lifelong laborers. Knowledge accumulated over generations, which privies were easiest to maintain, which routes were fastest through the streets, which fields produced the best crops from human fertilizer. Some families gained a reputation for reliability, able to handle the most difficult pits and the heaviest loads. Their names were whispered with a mixture of respect and disgust, known for skill, but never embraced by polite society. The apprenticeship was also a lesson in secrecy. The work of a Gong farmer was both vital and taboo, and knowledge of pits, waste transport, and field placement was jealously guarded. A young apprentice learned not only to clean but to be silent. Speaking too freely could bring embarrassment to households, punishment from masters, or worse, accusations of theft. Gossip about what one saw in a pit could spread fear, suspicion, and blame. A Gong farmer's life demanded discretion, and teaching an apprentice included teaching him when to speak, and more importantly, when to remain silent. Despite the danger and social isolation, there were rewards for those who endured. Skilled Gong farmers could earn more than ordinary laborers, especially if they took on contracts from large estates, monasteries, or cities. Experienced men might supervise teams, manage multiple carts, or specialize in the most difficult and profitable pits. Their work, though unseen and unpraised, was critical. Masters sometimes allowed apprentices to inherit these positions, ensuring that families maintained a presence in the trade for generations. Yet apprenticeships were not easy on the young. The smell, the darkness, the isolation, all were tests of will. Many failed. Some quit after a single night, unable to bear the air, the muck, the fear. Others survived, learning to harden themselves, to endure, to move like shadows through the city. Those who persevered often developed a strange camaraderie with their fellow laborers, bound together by a shared endurance that few outside the trade could comprehend. Families also passed down methods for personal survival. Herbs soaked in vinegar to mask the stench, heavy clothing to shield skin, careful timing to avoid the worst gases. These were part of the oral tradition. Apprentices learned how to pace themselves, when to rest, when to haul, how to anticipate dangerous moments. The wisdom of generations allowed them to survive in conditions that might overwhelm a newcomer. Interestingly, some apprenticeships blurred the line between survival and pride. Despite societal revulsion, young men who learned the trade understood its essential role. They saw the fields nourished, the crops grown, the streets kept clean. In private, there was a sense of mastery, a hidden pride in skills few others possessed. They were guardians of life, though unacknowledged. And while they were socially marginalized, economically and practically, they held knowledge that made them indispensable. In this way, the Gong farmer's profession was preserved across generations. Fathers trained sons, masters trained apprentices, and the knowledge of pits, buckets, ropes, and fields persisted even as society shunned the men who wielded it. The work was grueling, filthy, dangerous, and socially isolating, but it was also a tradition, a line of men who carried a secret responsibility for the health and survival of their communities. Thus, the apprenticeship of a Gong farmer was more than just learning to shovel. It was a rite of endurance, a passage into a shadowed world, a careful instruction in survival, discretion, and resilience. It forged men who could navigate the literal and metaphorical muck of their society, carrying on a vital, if despised, profession that shaped the city above and the fields beyond. Nightfall in Tudor England was not merely a backdrop for Gong Farmers, it was both their ally and their adversary. While darkness allowed them to perform their necessary labor in relative secrecy, it also exposed them to dangers that few other trades faced. The streets were treacherous, not only because of the uneven cobblestones and mud, but because criminals and desperate men lurked in shadows, ready to exploit vulnerability. Traveling with carts loaded with waste was particularly hazardous. To outsiders, these carts seemed innocuous, merely foul-smelling containers, but to those in need, they represented both opportunity and temptation. The coins paid to Gong Farmers were sometimes more coveted than their stinking cargo. A nighttime attack could leave a man battered, his load lost, and his life threatened. Even skilled Gong Farmers could not always avoid thieves, and a misstep in timing or route could have deadly consequences. The labor itself was physically perilous. Navigating narrow alleys with a heavy cart of wet waste required strength, skill, and constant vigilance. Wheels could slip on stones, slick with rain, or refuse. Horses, if used, were prone to panic at the stench or sudden sounds, risking overturned carts and crushed limbs. A Gong Farmer was never truly safe, even in his routine. Every step could bring a sprained ankle, a broken bone, or a bucket of human filth spilling onto the street and onto himself. Beyond accidents and criminals, there was another danger: angry townsfolk. While most respected the necessity of their work, the foul stench was unavoidable. Windows would slam, children would cry, and occasionally, someone would hurl insults or even objects at the cart and its driver. Being a Gong Farmer demanded nerves of steel and thick skin, both literally and figuratively. The work was an endless balance between speed, secrecy, and survival, navigating a city that wanted cleanliness but hated the man who ensured it. Some Gong Farmers took precautions that bordered on the ingenious. Lanterns were dimmed to avoid drawing attention. Routes were planned carefully, avoiding known trouble spots. Teams moved together when possible, providing mutual protection. The stench itself was sometimes used as a deterrent. Those who approached too closely quickly realized that nothing about a cart of waste was appealing. And yet no measure was foolproof. A determined thief, a drunken brawl, or a sudden horse panic could undo even the most careful preparation. The social perception of Gong Farmers also heightened these dangers. Because they were regarded as low status and unclean, authorities were often slow to intervene if a farmer was attacked or robbed. Justice for them was elusive. Their complaints were taken less seriously than those of wealthier citizens. A Gong Farmer's life and labor were treated as expendable. This social stigma, combined with the inherent danger of night work, made the profession one of the most perilous in Tudor cities. Despite these risks, the Gong Farmers persisted. Their work was essential, their knowledge specialized, and their skills irreplaceable. Communities could not survive without them. Their resilience was remarkable, not just in facing physical dangers, but in enduring the social scorn, the smell, the solitude, and the constant threat of disease. To be a Gong Farmer required not only physical strength, but psychological fortitude, the ability to move through darkness, confrontation, and danger while performing the most reviled labor imaginable. There were, naturally, tales of Gong Farmers who became legends in their communities, men who survived robbery, collapsed pits, or deadly fumes, and continued to work through decades of night labor. They were whispered about in awe and horror, the men who could walk through filth, face plague and thieves alike, and yet return home at dawn as if nothing had happened. Their lives were marked by endurance that few could imagine, and their survival was testimony to both skill and sheer tenacity. Even so, there was no glory, no applause. Their deeds were invisible, their risks unacknowledged. While others slept, dreamed, and lived comfortably, the Gong Farmer's night was a battle zone of filth, shadow, and danger. Each cart hauled, each pit emptied, was a triumph over both nature and society, a triumph unnoticed, often uncelebrated, and yet utterly essential. And so the Gong Farmer continued, night after night, season after season, moving through streets that feared him, carrying cargo that repelled, navigating hazards that could kill, and surviving where many would have perished. In this life, courage was measured not by fame or accolades, but by the ability to endure in a world that desired cleanliness without ever appreciating the man who ensured it. By the time dawn painted the sky, the danger had passed for now, but the weight of the previous night remained. Limbs ached, muscles were sore, clothes were soaked and foul, and the mind carried the memory of threats narrowly avoided. Yet the Gong Farmer would rise again that evening, for the city needed him, and there was no other willing to take the burden. The tools of the Gong Farmer were deceptively simple, yet they carried the weight of a life built upon endurance, skill, and constant vigilance. A sturdy shovel, a strong bucket, a rope, and occasionally a lantern were the instruments that defined the trade. Each was more than a mere object. They were lifelines, weapons against filth, disease, and structural collapse. To the untrained eye, a shovel was just a shovel. To a Gong Farmer, it was a tool for survival, carefully selected, maintained, and wielded with precision. The shovel itself had to be strong, yet light enough to maneuver in tight spaces. Edges were sharpened to scrape the walls of cesspits cleanly without causing instability. The handle, often reinforced with iron or wrapped in leather, needed to absorb shocks and prevent slipping from moist or muddy hands. A poor quality shovel could mean disaster. One snap could leave a man trapped in the pit, crushed under debris, or forced to abandon a bucketful of human waste. Mastery over the shovel was learned only through long nights of labor, each movement rehearsed, each angle memorized, until it became almost instinctive. Buckets were another critical tool. Large, heavy, and prone to spilling, they demanded careful handling. Some were made of wood with metal bands to resist splitting. Others of leather, stitched tightly to hold wet, heavy loads. The capacity had to balance efficiency with safety. Too small and trips multiplied. Too large and a slip or tilt could be catastrophic. Buckets were lifted, lowered, and balanced in a dance that required timing, coordination, and trust among team members. Even the rope used to hoist them was vital. A frayed rope could result in a catastrophic fall, dumping contents into the pit or worse, onto the farmer below. Lanterns were rare but invaluable. A dimly lit lamp could illuminate the edges of a pit, reveal structural weaknesses, and alert the farmer to unexpected hazards. But too much light was dangerous, drawing attention to one's presence in a city that preferred the Gong Farmer invisible. Some relied on natural intuition, placing lamps only where necessary, using their experience to sense dangers in darkness. Over decades, many learned to judge depth, air quality, and solidity with nothing more than the feel of the walls, the smell of the waste, and the weight of the shovel in hand. Techniques were honed to minimize exposure to deadly gases. Methane, ammonia, and hydrogen sulfide often collected in the pits, invisible and odorless in dangerous concentrations. A single careless inhalation could induce dizziness, unconsciousness, or death. Experienced Gong farmers developed subtle rituals, tapping the shovel against pit walls to release pockets of gas before entering, breathing shallowly near openings, timing movements with shifts in wind or air circulation. Every action was precautionary, a step toward survival in an environment that was as deadly as it was repulsive. Collapsing walls were another constant hazard. Stone, brick, or timber could crumble under the weight of accumulated waste. Skilled farmers learned how to test walls with a push of the shovel, how to remove waste gradually to avoid destabilization, and how to reinforce weak sections temporarily with scrap wood or tightly packed straw. The work demanded a combination of brute strength, precision, and intuition, a constant mental calculation of weight, balance, and motion. Ropes and pulleys became extensions of the farmer's body, allowing heavy buckets to be lifted safely to the surface. The hoisting required coordination between men above and below, communication often limited to short shouts or signals. One misstep could mean disaster. The bucket could swing violently. Breaking the rope or striking a man or a rope could slip, dropping its contents back into the pit. Years of practice taught farmers to move in synchrony, to anticipate shifts in weight, and to act instinctively when danger arose. Cleaning and maintenance of these tools was also critical, though far from simple. Shovels and buckets were washed in nearby streams, vats or even buckets of water, but the smell could not be entirely removed. Iron parts rusted, wooden handles split, ropes frayed, all requiring constant attention. A neglected tool could be the difference between a night's successful labor and a disastrous collapse. For Gong farmers, maintenance was never optional. It was as much a part of their labor as shoveling itself. Some techniques extended beyond survival and into efficiency. Farmers learned how to remove the waste in layers, how to distribute weight in buckets to ease lifting, and how to navigate the tight spaces between pit walls. The placement of feet, hands, and body became a careful choreography designed to maximize output while minimizing risk. This was precision work, a dark craft that demanded both mind and body in equal measure. And yet, despite all these tools, methods, and experience, the work remained inherently dangerous. No equipment could fully protect against a sudden collapse, a rogue gas pocket, or an unexpected attack while transporting loads. Every night was a gamble, every pit a battlefield, every cartload a test of skill and endurance. The Gong farmer's survival was a testament not only to physical strength, but to knowledge, intuition, and meticulous attention to detail. In the hands of a skilled Gong farmer, shovel, bucket, rope, and lantern became extensions of his own body, a toolkit of survival against nature, filth, and social scorn. Each tool was vital, each technique honed over years, and every night spent in the darkness reaffirmed the extraordinary skill required to perform a task that most people could barely imagine, let alone endure. The trade demanded strength, skill, patience, and courage, and it was these qualities that elevated the Gong farmer above the mere label of poop collector. Though society sneered, the man in the pit wielded mastery over an environment that was deadly, repulsive, and essential all at once. The life of a Gong farmer was not only physically taxing, but psychologically grueling. Social isolation, constant exposure to filth, and the pervasive fear of disease and death created a mental landscape as dark as the pits they emptied. Few in Tudor society understood the psychological burden of a man whose life revolved around muck, fumes, and shadows. From the outside, the Gong farmer's world seemed incomprehensible. Friends, neighbors, and even family often avoided him, fearing contamination or simply repelled by the odor that clung to his skin and clothing. Invitations to social gatherings were rare, and casual conversation was even rarer. Children might run screaming at the sight of him. Housewives might shutter windows, and strangers on the street might cross to avoid him. This pervasive stigma forced the Gong farmer into a kind of social exile. Even when he earned enough to live comfortably, he remained a pariah, accepted only insofar as his labor served the needs of others. Isolation was compounded by the nocturnal nature of the work. While the city slept, the Gong farmer moved through streets, alleys, and private gardens in darkness. His companions were few, other laborers, perhaps a cart driver or apprentice, and the omnipresent shadows of empty streets. There were no friendly conversations, no warmth of camaraderie, beyond the occasional shared grunt of effort or the brief nods exchanged with trusted colleagues. Nights were long, lonely, and haunted by the stench of human waste and the knowledge of danger-collapsing pits, toxic gases, and opportunistic thieves. Superstition also played a role in the psychological landscape of the trade. Many Tudor citizens believed that disease and misfortune were linked to moral or spiritual corruption. Because the Gong farmer touched what society deemed unclean, he was often thought to carry a kind of spiritual taint. Plague, sickness, or crop failure could be blamed on him, at least in whispers, adding a layer of fear and resentment to his already challenging life. Some believed that Gong farmers had to follow rituals to protect themselves from curses or spirits haunting the cesspits. Certain men might carry charms, recite prayers, or avoid certain nights when superstition dictated increased danger. This mingling of physical labor and social prejudice weighed heavily on the mind. The Gong farmer lived at the intersection of necessity and revulsion, his profession vital yet despised. The knowledge that one's work kept cities clean, fields fertile, and people healthy might provide a private sense of purpose, but it rarely outweighed the public scorn. Every shovelful of muck was a reminder of both human dependence and human contempt, a constant balancing act between pride and skill and shame imposed by society. The psychological toll was intensified by the ever-present danger of disease. Medieval medicine was primitive, and even a minor cut or abrasion could lead to infection. Many Gong farmers contracted persistent fevers, rashes, or respiratory issues due to their constant exposure to waste. Some feared the plague, tuberculosis, or other illnesses that could emerge silently from the very pits they cleaned. This fear was both rational and constant, a pressure that hung over every movement, every night, and every pit descended into. Family life, when it existed, could also be strained. A Gong farmer spouse might hesitate to let children play near the house. Social stigma could prevent sons from finding respectable apprenticeships outside the trade, effectively passing the isolation down through generations. Yet families endured, finding ways to carve out domestic normalcy amidst the shadows of their husband-s or father-s work. Sometimes the work became a point of pride-a-secret acknowledgement that, despite all the danger, discomfort, and social scorn, the family survived because of his labor. Mental resilience was therefore critical. Gong farmers developed coping mechanisms that might seem strange to outsiders. Humor, dark or crude, was common, serving as a psychological shield against the constant disgust of their environment. Rhythm and repetition in their work provided focus, almost meditative, allowing men to perform tasks for hours without succumbing to nausea or panic. Some relied on silent observation, watching the interplay of tools, pits, and air currents, allowing their minds to focus on patterns rather than the filth itself. Yet, no matter the strategies, the work took a toll. Loneliness, fear, and stigma were constant companions. Some men descended into despair, others into superstition, and a few hardened themselves almost beyond human sensibility, becoming figures of folklore whispered about in both awe and horror. To survive as a Gong farmer required mental fortitude comparable to the physical endurance needed to lift, dig, and haul under the most revolting conditions imaginable. In the end, the Gong farmer's life was a paradox of invisibility and importance, revulsion and necessity, fear and resilience. He existed at the margins of society, performing labor that no one else would, sustaining life in a city that neither celebrated nor welcomed him, enduring psychological pressures that few could imagine. In every bucket lifted, every pit emptied, every night endured. He carried not only filth, but the weight of society's dependence and disdain, a burden as heavy as the muck itself. Despite the constant scorn, dangers, and psychological burdens, Gong farmers were not entirely without recognition or reward. Their labor, though reviled, was essential to the functioning of Tudor society, and in some rare moments, their skill and reliability were acknowledged in ways both practical and, occasionally, grudgingly respectful. Payment, contracts, and occasional tips offered tangible affirmation, even if social acceptance remained elusive. Gong farmers were usually paid per job or per cartload, and the rates could vary widely depending on the size of the pit, the difficulty of access, and the distance to be transported. Clearing a small household privy might earn a modest sum, while emptying the massive cesspits beneath a monastery or castle could provide a week's or even a month's wages in a single night. These contracts were often negotiated with precision, as wealthier landowners and religious houses depended on the reliability and skill of the farmer. A competent Gong farmer could command higher wages, particularly if he had a reputation for efficiency, discretion, and endurance. Some households and estates went further, offering bonuses or gifts for exceptional work. Coins tucked discreetly into pockets extra provisions, or small tokens of appreciation. These gestures, though rare, were cherished. They were acknowledgments that, while society at large despised the work, those who directly benefited from it understood its value. In a world where survival depended on sanitation and fertile fields, this quiet respect carried significant weight. Payment was not always cash. Sometimes it came in goods or services. Farmers might receive food, lodging, or tools in exchange for their labor. For apprentices or younger men, these forms of payment were particularly valuable, providing sustenance and equipment that facilitated survival in a trade where physical endurance and preparedness were essential. Occasionally, a respected master would ensure his apprentice received a favorable contract or favorable placement, creating a lineage of recognition that transcended the immediate scorn of neighbors. Contracts could extend beyond simple pit clearing. Some farmers were employed as regular city contractors, responsible for clearing multiple pits across neighborhoods or even entire parishes. This not only guaranteed a steady income but also a measure of prestige within their limited social circle. Other Gong farmers specialized in transporting waste to farms or fields, a role that elevated them in the eyes of farmers and market gardeners who depended on the fertilizer they provided. Here, the Gong farmers' work was both visible and valued, though always behind the scenes and rarely celebrated publicly. Interestingly, certain individuals became known for their exceptional reliability and skill. These men were trusted with the most difficult tasks, the deepest pits, the largest loads, or the most hazardous routes. Reputation mattered enormously. A Gong farmer who failed to deliver, lost a load, or caused damage risked not only financial loss, but the potential loss of future employment. Conversely, those who excelled could build a quiet legacy of competence, passing down the knowledge to apprentices and gaining a measure of respect within the trade. Even amidst societal revulsion, there were subtle signs of acknowledgement. Some city officials, abbots, or estate managers understood the unique challenges of the work and valued the men who undertook it. A master who recognized skill might extend contract durations, offer higher pay, or recommend a farmer to others in need. These rare acknowledgments were deeply appreciated, offering a sense of professional validation in a life otherwise dominated by social stigma and physical hardship. Occasionally, superstition and folklore added an unexpected form of respect. Some communities believed that a skilled Gong farmer, able to survive pits and foul air that would kill others, possessed resilience bordering on the supernatural. Tales spread of men who could endure stench and danger with uncanny ease, able to navigate collapsing walls, noxious fumes, and aggressive dogs without injury. Such stories, whispered in awe, framed the Gong farmer not just as a laborer but as someone uniquely adapted to a world others could not survive. Despite these moments, the acknowledgement remained private, practical, and transactional rather than public or celebratory. A Gong farmer might earn the respect of a wealthy landlord, the gratitude of a monastery, or the quiet admiration of fellow laborers, but society at large continued to view him with disgust. Even high pay or recognition could not erase the pervasive stigma that defined the profession. Yet these rare acknowledgments mattered enormously to the men themselves. Payment, tips, contracts, and small gestures of appreciation reinforced the value of their labor. They reminded Gong farmers that, despite the social disdain, their work was indispensable. Each coin earned, each token of recognition received, was a tangible acknowledgement that their nights of backbreaking, malodorous labor were meaningful, that the society they served depended on them, and that survival and skill were worthy of reward, even if invisibly. In this strange balance, the Gong farmer navigated a paradoxical existence, despised yet essential, invisible yet impactful, cursed yet occasionally acknowledged. Their labor shaped cities, nourished fields, and sustained communities, and for those rare moments of recognition, they glimpsed a measure of the dignity and respect that society otherwise denied them. The profession of the Gong farmer, as essential as it was in Tudor England, was not destined to last forever. Slowly, inexorably, changes in sanitation, urban planning, and technology began to diminish the need for men willing to descend into the pits at night and haul human waste through the streets. What had once been a critical trade, passed down through generations and executed with skill and endurance, gradually became obsolete. The earliest signs of change were subtle. Innovations in plumbing and the introduction of rudimentary sewers in some cities began to divert waste more efficiently, reducing the reliance on manual removal. Privies were improved with stone or brick constructions that allowed for more systematic cleaning, and in some wealthy households, cesspits were emptied less frequently thanks to better containment. Even the introduction of lime and other chemical substances to treat waste helped neutralize odors and break down matter, making human excrement less immediately hazardous and less dependent on constant removal. As urban populations grew, the scale of sanitation challenges expanded. Cities became denser, streets narrower, and waste removal more complicated. This prompted local authorities and emerging municipal systems to formalize sanitation efforts, employing men in more organized frameworks that differed from the traditional Gong Farmer system. Contracts were standardized, routes became regulated, and municipal supervision replaced some of the discretion and independence that Gong Farmers had once enjoyed. Those who once moved freely at night were now beholden to city ordinances and schedules. For the Gong Farmers themselves, this transition was both a threat and an opportunity. Older men who had spent decades in the trade found their skills in less demand, and some were forced to retire or seek work in related manual labor. Younger apprentices, however, had opportunities to adapt their knowledge to new roles. Expertise in navigating waste, handling heavy loads, and maintaining hygiene under challenging conditions became transferable to emerging industries such as industrial cleaning, urban maintenance, and even early forms of public health services. The grim and dangerous work of the pit became a foundation for modern sanitation labor, though the social stigma remained. Technological changes accelerated the decline. The invention of more effective sewage systems in the 17th and 18th centuries transformed waste management. Underground drains, flushing systems, and public latrines reduced the reliance on human cartage of waste. The night laborers who once carried buckets of excrement through narrow streets saw their profession vanish almost overnight in some regions. Their work, once indispensable, became obsolete, leaving a unique social and economic niche empty. The Gong Farmer, a man who had been crucial to survival, slowly disappeared from the streets. Despite the decline, the legacy of Gong Farmers persisted in subtle ways. The techniques developed over centuries handling heavy, hazardous materials, maintaining sanitation under adverse conditions, navigating urban landscapes at night laid the groundwork for modern municipal labor systems. The principles of safety, organization, and efficiency learned in the pits became embedded in later trades. The resilience, skill, and discretion required of Gong Farmers echoed into the future, even as the men themselves faded from history. Social memory, however, was slower to adapt. In literature, folklore, and popular imagination, Gong Farmers were remembered as symbols of revulsion, endurance, and survival. Tales of men working in darkness, facing stench, disease, and danger, circulated as cautionary stories, moral lessons, or odd curiosities. They were remembered not for their contributions to urban planning or agriculture, but as figures straddling the border between human necessity and societal disgust. In this way, the Gong Farmer became a relic of history, haunting the collective imagination while disappearing from practical life. The decline of the profession also changed the lives of those families tied to it. Generations who had inherited knowledge, tools, and trade secrets found themselves in a transitional period. Some turned to other forms of labor, cart drivers, farmhands, urban laborers. Others sought trades less stigmatized, carrying with them the skills honed in darkness. The transition was not easy. Social prejudice lingered, and the unique expertise of Gong Farmers did not always translate seamlessly into new employment. Yet survival and adaptation were constants in their history, and many families managed to persist even as the trade that had defined them vanished. Ultimately, the Gong Farmer's story is one of transition. From indispensable labor to obsolete relic, he illustrates the complex interplay between necessity, skill, and societal perception. His work shaped cities, fed crops, and protected public health, yet the very success of his labor improving sanitation and making life easier led to the decline of his own trade. In the end, the Gong Farmer's disappearance was not a failure, but a testament to the impact he had achieved. A society that no longer needed him was paradoxically healthier, cleaner, and more prosperous because of the very work he had done in darkness for centuries. Though largely forgotten today, the Gong Farmer's legacy endures in the foundations of modern sanitation, in the principles of municipal labor, and in the quiet recognition that human ingenuity and endurance often thrive in the unlikeliest and most unpleasant of circumstances. His story remains a reminder that even the most reviled labor can be central to human survival, and that history often honors the unseen hands that make life possible. As we arrive at the final reflection on the life of a Tudor Gong farmer, it becomes clear that this was more than a simple occupation. It was a testament to human endurance, skill, and resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity. To modern eyes, the work seems grotesque, humiliating, and almost incomprehensible. Yet, in the context of Tudor society, it was both vital and profoundly skilled, demanding physical strength, mental fortitude, and unwavering courage. The Gong farmer existed in a paradoxical world. By day, the city around him thrived, unaware of the labor underpinning its cleanliness and sustenance. Streets were navigable, households were habitable, crops were nourished with fertilizer derived from the very excrement he removed. Yet the society that relied on his work despised him, relegated him to shadows, whispered insults behind his back, and avoided his presence at every opportunity. He was both indispensable and invisible, a paradox that defined his existence. Physical endurance was only one aspect of his remarkable life. To descend into cesspits required nerve, balance, and an intimate understanding of dangerous environments. The stink was unrelenting, the air potentially lethal, the walls of the pits treacherous. Yet these men mastered their surroundings, learning to read the subtle signs of instability, to anticipate the behavior of gases, and to manipulate tools with precision. Each night they performed what was effectively a high-risk occupational ballet, balancing loads, shoveling waste, and navigating darkness with a combination of skill, intuition, and learned technique. Mental resilience was equally critical. Social isolation, the psychological toll of constant exposure to filth, and the threat of disease and violence created an environment few could survive. To endure required a blend of pragmatism, superstition, humor, and sheer determination. Coping mechanisms developed over years. Dark humor, rhythmic work patterns, and silent observation allowed the Gong farmer to navigate the most revolting and dangerous circumstances. His survival depended not only on physical prowess, but on mastery over fear, nausea, and social scorn. There was, paradoxically, a form of dignity in his labor. Though unacknowledged publicly, the Gong farmer's work sustained society. Cities functioned, fields were fertilized, disease was partially controlled, and society continued largely because of the men who embraced this grueling, dangerous profession. Even fleeting recognition, a coin tucked into a pocket, a token of appreciation from a master, or a whispered acknowledgement of skill affirmed the crucial role they played. Their labor was invisible yet foundational, despised yet indispensable. Over time, the profession faded. Technological advances, municipal sanitation systems, and changing social norms reduced the need for men to descend into pits and transport waste by night. Those who survived the transition adapted, transferring their skills to related trades, yet the unique mastery of the Gong farmer became a relic of history. What once defined entire families for generations disappeared almost entirely, leaving behind stories, folklore, and rare historical accounts to remind us of the harsh realities of Tudor life. Yet, in reflecting on the life of the Gong farmer, one cannot ignore the enduring lessons. His existence demonstrates that the most unpleasant, overlooked, and socially stigmatized labor can be essential, demanding, and even heroic. His survival required ingenuity, resilience, and courage, and his impact, though unseen and uncelebrated, was profound. In a society that both depended on him and despised him, the Gong farmer thrived in the shadows, embodying the paradox of human labor that is both necessary and reviled. Ultimately, the Gong farmer's story is a meditation on invisibility, endurance, and dignity. Though his work was foul and often dangerous, it was also indispensable, skilled, and historically significant. He lived in darkness, yet shaped the lives of thousands above him. He bore social scorn, yet carried society forward. His story challenges us to reconsider the value of labor, the complexities of survival, and the hidden histories of those who sustained civilization in the most unglamorous and essential ways. To remember the Gong farmer is to honor the unseen, the reviled, and the courageous. It is to recognize that even the most despised occupations can carry profound skill, risk, and moral significance. And in the shadowed pits of Tudor England, amidst the stench and danger, the Gong farmer endured not merely to survive, but to uphold a society that rarely thanked him, rarely saw him, yet could not have lived without him. In this endurance there is both horror and awe, a legacy of human resilience that continues to echo, even centuries later. The Gong Farmer may have been invisible, his labor malodorous and despised, but history remembers him, not for the smell he bore, not for the scorn he endured, but for the invisible, extraordinary work that kept cities alive, fields fertile, and society functional. In every dark pit and in every night-long toil, the Gong Farmer's life remains a testament to the courage, skill, and endurance that human survival sometimes demands.